On February 2nd, 1943, the surrender of the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad marked one of the most devastating moments of World War II. This event sealed the defeat of the Axis on the Eastern Front, symbolizing the collapse of the Nazi war machine in the region and initiating a brutal fate for the captured German soldiers. Before their surrender, these men had endured hellish conditions. Hunger, extreme cold, and exhaustion from months of combat had left the German troops on the brink of death. But what awaited them under Soviet custody was beyond imagination. Forced marches through the harsh Russian winter, prisoner camps with skyrocketing mortality rates, and years of forced labor under inhumane conditions. We will explore the dark fate of the 91,000 German soldiers captured in Stalingrad, a story of suffering, survival, and the harshest consequences of war. Was it as chilling as believed? Were the Nazis shown any mercy? What happened to them? Stalingrad, the deadly trap of the Eastern Front. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the most brutal and decisive confrontations of World War II. Initiated in the summer of 1942, this campaign represented both a strategic and symbolic objective for Adolf Hitler. Capturing Stalingrad would mean controlling important trade routes and resources of the Caucasus, as well as a propaganda victory by taking the city named after the Soviet leader. However, what began as an ambitious German offensive turned into a deadly trap for the Sixth Army. The German strategy, led by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, underestimated both the Soviet resistance and the extreme conditions of the Russian winter. Paulus had assured his superiors that the advance would be swift, relying on the technological and tactical superiority of his forces. However, the German troops soon encountered fierce resistance in every street and building of Stalingrad. The Soviets, led by General Vasily Chuikov, adopted an urban combat strategy known as rat warfare, fighting at close range in the city's ruins. This neutralized the German advantage in artillery and tanks, making every meter gained an unbearable cost. As the fighting intensified in the city, the Soviet High Command, under Stalin and General Georgy Zhukov, prepared a massive counteroffensive known as Operation Uranus. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launched a two-front attack, encircling the German Sixth Army and its allies in a deadly trap. This carefully planned movement trapped more than 300,000 soldiers in an area without access to supplies or escape routes. Declassified Soviet archives detail how German commanders, including Paulus, repeatedly requested permission to retreat before the encirclement was complete. However, Hitler rejected these requests, insisting that the Sixth Army must hold out at all costs. In one of his communications, Hitler declared, "The Sixth Army will remain in Stalingrad. It is a matter of national honor." The impact of the encirclement was devastating. Without access to food, ammunition, or adequate winter clothing, German soldiers began to succumb to hunger, extreme cold, and diseases. Temperatures in Stalingrad during the winter of 1942 to 1943 dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, freezing men alive in their positions. A German prisoner who survived the siege recalled years later, "We saw our comrades die every day. There was no food, only a watery soup that did not fill the stomach. The cold was unbearable, and many simply lay down to die." Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe attempted to supply the Sixth Army through an airlift, but this operation proved insufficient. Of the 600 tons of daily supplies required, only 100 to 150 tons arrived. Additionally, German aircraft faced intense Soviet anti-aircraft fire, resulting in the loss of numerous aircraft and crews. The situation inside the pocket deteriorated rapidly. By January 1943, German soldiers were reduced to eating horses, dogs, and even rats to survive. Moral collapse began to spread among the troops, with many soldiers writing letters to their families that were never sent. These letters, later recovered by the Soviets, reveal the psychological state of the trapped men. One of them said, "Dear mother, if you read this, I am probably no longer alive. We are surrounded and there is no hope of help. I am tired, hungry, and frozen, but I try to stay strong for you." Finally, on February 2, 1943, Friedrich Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal days earlier in an attempt by Hitler to prevent his surrender, capitulated along with the remnants of the Sixth Army. It was the first time in history that a German officer of this rank had surrendered, marking a milestone in the war. Of the 300,000 soldiers initially trapped, more than half had died, and about 91,000 were taken prisoner. The psychological impact of this surrender was profound for both the German soldiers and the Nazi war machine. For the combatants, surrender meant facing an uncertain fate in Soviet hands, which many feared would be worse than death. For the Nazi regime, Stalingrad was a devastating blow to morale and the perception of the German army's invincibility. On the Soviet side, the victory in Stalingrad was celebrated as a turning point in the war. It marked the beginning of a series of offensives that would gradually push the Axis forces back toward Germany. However, for the German prisoners, surrender was only the beginning of a new hell. The fate that awaited them under Soviet custody would be even darker, marked by endless marches, hunger, diseases, and forced labor. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat. It was a testament to how war can destroy not only bodies but also spirits. What began as a strategic offensive ended as a deadly trap for the Sixth Army, an episode that would remain etched in memory as one of the darkest chapters of World War II. The beginning of torment, death marches in the Russian winter. The surrender in Stalingrad marked the beginning of an even more relentless torment for the captured German soldiers. With the Sixth Army completely dismantled, Soviet troops began the process of transferring the prisoners to labor camps deep within the Soviet Union. These marches, conducted in the midst of the Russian winter, became a scene of unimaginable suffering, where cold, hunger, and exhaustion took a devastating toll. From the moment the surrender was ordered, the captured soldiers were stripped of any personal equipment that could help them withstand the climate. Boots were replaced with inadequate footwear or simply confiscated, forcing many to walk barefoot on the frozen snow. Food was almost non-existent, and water, when provided, came from contaminated sources or hastily collected melted snow. Declassified Soviet archives mention that these conditions were not accidental. They were part of a deliberate calculation to punish the prisoners and weaken their physical and mental resistance. Temperatures during the marches easily reached -20 degrees Celsius. Under these extreme conditions, prisoners walked for hours without rest, covering tens of kilometers a day. Those who could not keep up were beaten or executed on the spot. A survivor recalled in his memoirs, "We knew that stopping meant death. Some fell from exhaustion, and the guards simply left them there, dead or dying. We couldn't do anything to help them." Throughout these marches, the German soldiers faced not only the climate, but also the brutal treatment of some of the Soviet soldiers escorting them. Although there were orders to keep the prisoners alive for later use in forced labor, the guards often acted with cruelty, partly as revenge for the atrocities committed by the Nazis on Soviet soil. A captured document after the war mentions how some prisoners were forced to carry heavy equipment while marching, accelerating their physical collapse. Hunger quickly became one of the main tormentors of the prisoners. Rations, when they existed, consisted of small amounts of stale bread or watery soups, insufficient to sustain weakened men. Some tried to survive by eating roots or pieces of wood, while others succumbed to hunger in the middle of the march. In a testimony recorded by German investigators after the war, a prisoner recounted, "There were days when we dreamed of food. Anything would have served, a piece of meat, a slice of bread. But all we had was snow and emptiness." Despite the extreme conditions, the Soviets used these marches not only as a means of transport, but also as a form of psychological control. The dehumanization of the prisoners was evident in every step. Groups were constantly counted and reorganized, often without notice, creating an environment of uncertainty and constant tension. Many captured soldiers lost their comrades in the chaos of the marches, separations that were often final. For some prisoners, the journey ended before reaching the camps. A Soviet military archive reveals that of the 91,000 soldiers captured in Stalingrad, thousands died during the marches. The casualties were so numerous that the roads they passed were marked by the frozen bodies of the fallen, a silent reminder of the brutality of these conditions. However, not all Soviet soldiers shared this attitude. Some guards, aware of the harshness of the marches, allowed brief rests or shared small portions of their own rations with the prisoners. These gestures, although rare, are mentioned in some testimonies as a glimmer of humanity amid the prevailing cruelty. A German prisoner recalled years later, "A guard gave me a piece of bread when he saw that I could no longer walk. I will never forget that gesture. It probably saved my life." As the prisoners approached their final destination, exhaustion and diseases became even more lethal factors. Dysentery, pneumonia, and typhus spread rapidly among the weakened men who lacked access to any medical care. Some prisoners chose to surrender to death, while others desperately clung to life. Declassified Soviet archives mention that, in some cases, military doctors attempted to provide basic aid, but resources were limited, and priorities were focused on Soviet troops. Upon arriving at the camps, the survivors of the marches were unrecognizable. The long weeks of privation had reduced young, strong men to shadows of themselves. Mortality rates remained high even after their arrival, as camp conditions offered no significant respite. The death marches were only the prelude to suffering that would extend for years. The images and testimonies of these marches remain a reminder of the brutality of war and the human cost of conflict. The German soldiers, trapped in a scenario where survival seemed impossible, faced not only the harshness of the Russian winter, but also the consequences of a war that showed no mercy to the vanquished. Camps of despair, the Soviet prisoner of war system. The Soviet prisoner of war camps represented an even darker fate for the German soldiers captured in Stalingrad. Scattered across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, from the frozen regions of Siberia to the arid landscapes of Central Asia, these camps became scenes of extreme suffering and exhausting labor. For the soldiers of the Sixth Army, arriving at these camps after the grueling death marches did not mark the end of their torment, but the beginning of a new stage of unimaginable hardships. The Soviet prisoner of war system was primarily designed to exploit the captives as a labor force in the reconstruction of the country. After the devastation caused by the German invasion, the need to rebuild cities, factories, and infrastructure was urgent. Prisoners, considered enemies of the people, were sent to camps where the priority was not their well-being, but maximizing their productivity. Declassified archives of the NKVD, the Soviet security agency in charge of administering the camps, detail how prisoners were distributed according to local economic needs. Conditions in these camps were terrible. Prisoners were housed in makeshift barracks, often without heating and with little protection from the elements. In Siberia, where temperatures could drop below -40 degrees Celsius, the lack of adequate clothing exacerbated their suffering. Food rations were minimal, generally consisting of stale bread and watery soups. A document from the administration of a camp in the Novosibirsk Oblast mentions that each prisoner received less than 1,000 calories a day, an insufficient amount for those working shifts of up to 12 hours. Forced labor was a constant in all the camps. Prisoners were used in a variety of tasks, from reconstructing bridges and buildings to extracting minerals in mines. In forested regions, many were assigned to logging, an extremely demanding task, especially in winter. A testimony from a prisoner who worked on the construction of a railway line describes the conditions. The work did not stop, regardless of the cold or our condition. The tools were rudimentary, and every strike of the shovel was a reminder that we were alone, left to our fate. Diseases also spread rapidly in the camps. Malnutrition and unsanitary conditions weakened the prisoners, making them vulnerable to infections such as dysentery, typhus, and tuberculosis. NKVD archives show that in some camps, mortality rates exceeded 50% in the first months of operation. The lack of adequate medical care meant that those who fell severely ill were often left to die, as they could not meet the work quotas. Despite these extreme conditions, some prisoners managed to survive thanks to support networks among comrades. They formed small communities within the camps, sharing food and protecting each other from the guards' abuse. These networks were crucial for maintaining hope in an environment where death was a constant threat. A German prisoner recalled how, in a camp near Moscow, a group of comrades took turns watching over each other while they slept, ensuring that no one perished from hypothermia during the night. The types of work assigned to the prisoners varied depending on the region and local needs. In cities devastated by German bombing, such as Stalingrad and Leningrad, the captives were used to clear rubble and rebuild buildings. In rural areas, many worked on collective farms, where their labor was essential to ensure the food supply. In some cases, prisoners were assigned to large-scale infrastructure projects, such as the construction of dams and railways. A Soviet archive details how a group of German prisoners participated in the construction of a hydroelectric plant on the Volga River, a project that required exhausting shifts and cost the lives of dozens of them. Escape attempts were rare due to the distances and inhospitable conditions surrounding the camps. However, some prisoners, desperate for freedom, risked everything to try to escape. NKVD archives mention several cases of escapes, although few were successful. In an incident recorded in 1945, a group of 5 prisoners attempted to escape from a camp in Siberia only to be recaptured a few days later. The reprisals were severe, serving as a warning to the others. The administration of the camps faced constant logistical dilemmas. Resources were limited, and the conflict between keeping the prisoners alive and maximizing their productivity was frequent. An internal NKVD report indicates that in some camps, work quotas were deliberately reduced during the winter months to avoid a drastic increase in deaths, while in others, authorities prioritized meeting economic objectives at any cost. By the end of the war, many of the Stalingrad prisoners had died in the camps. Of the 91,000 soldiers captured in February 1943, only 6,000 survived to return to Germany years later. This low survival rate reflects not only the extreme conditions of the camps, but also the impact of Soviet policies toward prisoners of war. The Soviet prisoner of war camps were not only places of forced labor, but also spaces of silent resistance and struggle for survival. For those who managed to endure these years of captivity, the physical and emotional scars remained as a constant reminder of the price of war and the brutality of a system that showed no compassion for the vanquished. Between hunger and cold, stories of survival. Survival in the Soviet prisoner of war camps was a constant struggle against hunger, cold, and despair. For the German soldiers captured in Stalingrad, staying alive in extreme conditions required a combination of physical resistance, ingenuity, and, above all, mutual support among comrades. These stories of survival, although marked by suffering, reveal the strength of the human spirit in the most adverse situations. Hunger was the most relentless enemy. The rations provided by the Soviet guards were minimal, designed only to keep the prisoners functional. Bread, the main source of sustenance, was often of poor quality and mixed with sawdust to increase its volume. Soups, made from water with small pieces of cabbage or potato, offered little nutritional value. In some camps, food was distributed according to the prisoners' productivity, creating constant competition to meet work quotas. An NKVD archive describes this policy as a way to incentivize the captives, although in practice, it only increased the physical wear and tear of the weaker prisoners. Faced with this reality, many resorted to creativity to find additional sources of food. Some prisoners caught rats or collected roots and herbs in the areas surrounding the camp. A testimony collected by German investigators after the war recounts how a group of prisoners managed to catch crows that perched near the barracks. Although the risk of being punished was high, these moments of ingenuity often meant the difference between life and death for many. Extreme cold was another constant challenge. In camps located in Siberia and other regions with severe climates, temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Prisoners, dressed in worn-out uniforms not designed to withstand such conditions, improvised additional clothing using burlap sacks or pieces of fabric found in the surroundings. Boots were a precious commodity, and those who did not have them used rags to wrap their feet, although this offered little protection against the frost. Nights were particularly dangerous, as the poorly constructed barracks provided little insulation. Many prisoners slept huddled together to conserve heat. In some cases, the stronger prisoners took turns staying awake to ensure their comrades did not succumb to hypothermia. A prisoner recalled years later, "We took care of each other. If someone stopped moving or breathing, we shook them to make sure they didn't give in to the cold. It was the only thing we could do." Solidarity among the prisoners was a crucial factor for survival. In an environment where dehumanization was the norm, small support networks offered a respite from the daily brutality. Sharing a piece of bread, dividing a blanket or simply offering words of encouragement helped maintain hope. These networks were not only spontaneous but also organized in some cases. In a camp near Moscow, prisoners formed an informal system to rotate the most exhausting tasks, ensuring that the weakest had a chance to recover. Forced labor, although exhausting, also offered opportunities to improve the chances of survival. Some prisoners assigned to tasks outside the camp managed to collect small amounts of food or materials that could be used for barter. A Soviet archive mentions that in certain cases, the guards turned a blind eye to these activities, recognizing that weakened prisoners were less productive. However, the risk of being discovered was always present, and the consequences could be lethal. Diseases were another constant obstacle. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, making common infections become death sentences. Dysentery, pneumonia, and typhus spread rapidly in the overcrowded and poorly ventilated barracks. In the absence of adequate medical care, prisoners relied on home remedies and mutual care. A prisoner recalled how a group of comrades used boiled snow to wash their wounds, an act that probably saved his life. The psychological impact of years of captivity was profound. The uncertainty about the future, combined with the loss of comrades and constant privations, brought many to the brink of mental collapse. Some prisoners found solace in religion, organizing clandestine services in the barracks. Others turned to writing, using pieces of charcoal to jot down their thoughts on the walls or pieces of wood. An archive found in a camp near Kazan contains several poems written by prisoners, some of which express hope, while others reflect deep despair. However, not everyone managed to overcome the trials of captivity. Mortality rates in some camps exceeded 50% during the harshest winters. For those who survived, the physical and emotional scars accompanied them long after their liberation. A survivor recounted how, even decades after returning to Germany, he still had nightmares about the days spent in the camp. In my dreams, I am always looking for food or trying to escape the cold. I can never forget what we went through there. Despite everything, these stories of survival highlight the power of human resilience. Amid hunger, cold, and inhumane conditions, the prisoners of war managed to find ways to resist and preserve their humanity. Their experiences not only shed light on the brutality of the Soviet camps, but also on the capacity of the human being to adapt and survive even in the darkest scenarios. Justice or vengeance, the treatment of German officers. The high-ranking officers of the German Sixth Army captured in Stalingrad faced a different fate from that of the common soldiers. While most prisoners were sent to forced labor camps, the officers were quickly separated and subjected to carefully calculated treatment. For the Soviet Union, these men were not only responsible for the military strategy of the Axis, but also symbols of a regime they sought to discredit and publicly blame for the horrors of the war. Interrogations began almost immediately after the surrender. The officers were transferred to isolated facilities, where specialized teams from the NKVD and the Red Army conducted intensive interrogations. Declassified Soviet archives revealed that the objective was not only to obtain military information, but also to build a propaganda case against the Nazi regime. Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army and the first German field marshal to surrender in military history, was one of the main targets of these efforts. Paulus, captured on February 2, 1943, was taken to a secret location where he underwent a series of interrogations designed not only to extract information, but also to convince him to collaborate with the Soviets. Transcripts of his statements show how the Soviets pressured him to publicly denounce Hitler and the Nazi regime. Under the promise of better living conditions and the assurance that he would not be executed, Paulus eventually agreed. Later, his testimony was used as a key tool in the Nuremberg trials and in Soviet propaganda, where he denounced the atrocities committed by the regime he once served. Not all captured officers received the same treatment. Those considered responsible for war crimes were subjected to summary trials, often held in the same locations where the atrocities had occurred. A notable example was the trial held in Stalingrad shortly after the surrender, where several German officers were sentenced to death for their role in the destruction of the city and abuses against the civilian population. The executions, carried out publicly, aimed to send a clear message to both the prisoners and the Soviet population. Executions were not always carried out immediately. In some cases, officers were held for months or even years before being tried. The Soviets used this time to gather additional evidence and ensure that the trials had the desired propaganda impact. An NKVD document mentions how the testimonies of captured rank-and-file soldiers were used to incriminate the officers, creating a unified narrative of guilt that justified the sentences. Among the captured officers were also figures that the Soviet regime considered useful for its own purposes. Some were selected to participate in ideological re-education programs, where they were taught the principles of communism in the hope of turning them into allies. Although most rejected these initiatives, some, like General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, agreed to collaborate with the Soviets. Seydlitz, who had commanded a corps of the Sixth Army in Stalingrad, became the leader of the League of German Officers, an organization created by the Soviets to promote opposition to the Nazi regime among prisoners of war. However, not all captured officers were subjected to trials or used as propaganda. Some disappeared into the vast Soviet labor camp system, where they faced the same brutal conditions as the rank-and-file soldiers. An internal NKVD report indicates that, in certain cases, local authorities did not differentiate between the ranks of the prisoners, assigning them to exhausting tasks regardless of their military position. This led to the deaths of some high-ranking officers far from the spotlight of trials and propaganda campaigns. The conditions of imprisonment for officers varied considerably depending on their strategic or propaganda importance. Those of higher rank, like Paulus, were housed in relatively comfortable facilities, where they were provided with adequate food and access to books and writing materials. In contrast, lower-ranking officers often faced harsh treatment, confronting hunger, cold, and diseases in conditions similar to those of common soldiers. The trials of the captured German officers also served to consolidate the Soviet narrative of the war. In these processes, the crimes of the Nazi regime were presented as acts of barbarism, in contrast to the ideals of justice and humanity promoted by the Soviet Union. However, the line between justice and vengeance was blurred. Public executions and sentences to forced labor sought not only to punish the guilty, but also to reinforce Soviet control over the war narrative. One of the most controversial aspects of the treatment of officers was how their post-war experiences were shaped by their decisions during captivity. Those who collaborated with the Soviets, like Paulus, faced rejection from their compatriots upon returning to Germany. In Paulus's case, his cooperation with the Soviets made him a pariah in West Germany, although he was received with some sympathy in East Germany, where he spent his final years. On the other hand, officers who refused to collaborate or were released after years of captivity faced significant challenges in reintegrating into society. Many returned with severe health problems and deep resentment toward the Soviet regime. These men, who had once led troops on the battlefield, found themselves struggling to find a place in a divided and reconstructing Germany. The treatment of the captured German officers in Stalingrad highlights the complexities of justice in times of war. Although some were responsible for heinous crimes, others were simply following orders in a conflict that showed no mercy to the vanquished. The trials, executions, and Soviet propaganda campaigns not only punished the leaders of the Sixth Army, but also left a legacy of difficult questions about the line between justice and vengeance in the context of total war. The last standing, the low survival rate of the captured. In the winter of 1943, after the fall of Stalingrad, more than 91,000 German soldiers were captured by the Red Army. Of those, only about 6,000 managed to return to Germany by the end of the war. The brutality of their fate is a grim testament to the consequences of defeat and the extreme conditions they faced in Soviet prisoner-of-war camps. Despite the severe losses, the survival rate of German prisoners of war in Stalingrad was notably low, raising questions about the specific conditions that led to such high mortality. When analyzing the causes of this high mortality rate, it is crucial to consider the factors that contributed to the tragedy: lack of food, diseases, extreme physical exhaustion, and mistreatment. Hunger was one of the main reasons why many prisoners did not survive. After the fierce battle, the prisoners were held in deplorable conditions. Food was scarce, and the prisoners, already weakened by the previous struggles, were subjected to a minimal diet that could not sustain their exhausted bodies. Insufficient nutrition, combined with the relentless cold of the Russian winter, caused their bodies to succumb rapidly to diseases, infections, and malnutrition. The cruel and dehumanizing treatment by the Soviet guards also played a fundamental role in the mortality rate. Soviet policy toward prisoners of war was clear. There was no sympathy or consideration for those captured. Stalinist regime propaganda had portrayed German soldiers as invaders and enemies of the Soviet people. Therefore, the prisoners were seen not only as defeated soldiers, but also as culprits of war crimes. Many were forced to perform hard labor under extreme conditions, while others were subjected to severe punishments without reason. Beatings, working in unsanitary conditions, and summary executions were common practices, further increasing the mortality rate. The lack of medical care was also a devastating factor. Amid the war, German prisoners of war did not receive the necessary treatment for wounds or diseases. The extreme cold, combined with the scarcity of medicines and collapsed infrastructure, caused even minor wounds to become quickly infected, with typhoid fever, dysentery, and scurvy claiming many lives. Field hospitals were overwhelmed and unable to cope with the number of sick and wounded, further exacerbating the situation. Comparing the mortality rate in Stalingrad with other prisoner of war campaigns reveals marked differences. Although the conditions for prisoners in other conflicts, such as World War I or World War II on other fronts, were also atrocious, few scenarios reached the level of brutality experienced by the German prisoners in Stalingrad. While in other parts of the Eastern Front or in prisoner of war camps in Western Europe, some managed to survive, the situation in Stalingrad was unique due to the magnitude of the German defeat and the retaliatory policies implemented by the USSR. Declassified secret archives from the time reveal that the treatment of the Stalingrad prisoners was considered an example of what the Soviets viewed as vengeance. In the first months after capture, the prisoners were transported to concentration camps in Siberia, where living conditions were extremely harsh. Temperatures dropped dangerously during the winter, and overcrowding worsened over time. Survivors' testimonies speak of unsustainable conditions. "They treated us like cattle, never thinking we were human," said one of them, recalling the endless days of forced labor, exhausting marches, and food scarcity. The contrast with other prisoners of war in similar situations, such as those captured in other key battles of the conflict, is also revealing. On the Western Front, for example, many German prisoners were treated with more humanity and in more bearable conditions. Although not exempt from abuses, the policy toward prisoners in Allied hands was generally more lenient, allowing for a higher survival rate. However, even those prisoners who survived Soviet captivity often returned with psychological and physical sequelae that would mark them for life. The low survival rate of the Stalingrad prisoners has been a subject of study among historians, some of whom argue that the USSR's policy of retaliation was not only due to the conditions of the camps, but also to the propaganda that the Stalinist regime promoted around revolutionary justice. The capture of German soldiers was seen as vengeance for the years of Nazi invasion and the horrors that the Soviet people had suffered at the hands of the Third Reich. It was not just a matter of war, but also of retribution for the atrocities committed during the occupation. In this context, the figures speak for themselves. Of the 91,000 prisoners of war captured, only 6,000 returned to Germany. The question that remains debated is whether these losses could have been avoided under different circumstances, or if the policy of retaliation and the relentless harshness of the Russian winter condemned the prisoners to a cruel fate. Through these events, we see not only the desperation of those who surrendered, but also the inexorable human cost that war imposes. The story of these men, sacrificed by the cruel reality of war, continues to resonate in the present, leaving an indelible mark on the collective memory of those who remember the horrors of the past. The long wait, liberation, and repatriation. The process of liberating German prisoners of war after World War II was long and complex. From 1949 to the early 1950s, thousands of soldiers captured in Stalingrad began to be released, although many still remained in captivity in various camps across the Soviet Union. Repatriation became one of the most challenging tasks for German and Soviet authorities, as the conditions of the prisoners in the post-war context made any attempt to return to normality extremely difficult. Initially, the liberation of prisoners was slow. The reconstruction of Europe after the war was a lengthy process, and the political situation between the Soviet Union and the Western powers also affected repatriation. The prisoners released by the Soviets often traveled in precarious conditions. Despite their freedom, those returning to Germany faced a reality completely different from what they knew before being captured. Upon returning, many prisoners found their homes in ruins, both physically and emotionally. Post-war Germany was marked by division and destruction, and the returning prisoners, weakened by years of mistreatment, disease, and hunger, felt alienated. The disconnection from their former homes and the transformation of their native country presented an even greater challenge. Those who had spent years under the Soviet regime and were viewed as traitors by some of their compatriots often did not receive a warm welcome. In a society rebuilding its national identity, the prisoners were perceived with distrust and even hostility. Many faced incomprehension from their own families, who did not understand the suffering they had endured in captivity. The memories of the war, along with the stigma of being a prisoner, left deep marks on their souls and bodies. The testimonies of some of the survivors reflect the profound impact of years of suffering. "It was like returning from another world," said a liberated prisoner who had spent more than 7 years in Siberia. "When I arrived home, I didn't recognize anything. It wasn't my country or my people. It was too changed." This sense of disorientation was common among those who returned, as the passage of time in the prisoner of war camps and the dehumanization they experienced left them with a feeling of displacement. Their former social and family ties no longer existed in the same way. Many found themselves as strangers in a country that, despite rebuilding its own future, felt completely alien to them. The physical condition of the prisoners was also one of the most severe consequences of their captivity. The malnutrition and diseases suffered during their time in the concentration camps made it difficult for many of the liberated to adapt to normal life. Their bodies were worn out, their strength waned with each passing day, and their spirits were no longer the same. Often, they struggled to find work or reintegrate into daily life, further aggravating their isolation. The psychological sequelae were also profound. The trauma of imprisonment, the constant humiliations, and the terrible experiences in the Soviet camps left scars that many carried for the rest of their lives. The social stigma, fueled by wartime narratives, also affected the liberated. In a Germany seeking reconstruction, being a prisoner of war meant being stigmatized. Nazi propaganda and the image of the heroic German soldier promoted by Hitler's regime no longer fit the reality of a defeated Germany. The former prisoners were often seen as men who had failed in their mission and had not lived up to what was expected of them. The testimonies reveal that many liberated prisoners of war felt strong pressure to reintegrate quickly and leave their past behind, although this was impossible. Returning to life in Germany became a constant struggle. Families tried to rebuild their homes, but often found themselves divided by the political tensions of the post-war period. Those who returned found a Germany fragmented, one part of the country under Soviet influence, and the other under the occupation of the Allied forces. The testimonies of the survivors recount the difficulties of adapting to the new reality, one in which many felt completely out of place. Echoes of the past, reflection on Stalingrad and its prisoners. The Battle of Stalingrad, one of the most brutal confrontations of World War II, left deep scars on both German and Soviet soldiers. For the Third Reich, the defeat in Stalingrad marked the beginning of its decline, while for the Soviet Union, it represented a symbol of resistance and victory against the Nazi invader. However, the human cost was immense on both sides. For the German prisoners, the war did not end with their surrender. In many cases, it had only just begun. The brutality of their captivity, marked by hunger, diseases, and mistreatment, laid bare the inhumane conditions that prisoners of war had to endure for years. The treatment of prisoners of war in Stalingrad and other Soviet concentration camps highlights the disconnect between war ethics and reality. The laws of war, such as the Geneva Convention, which regulate the humane treatment of prisoners, were ignored by both sides at various times. The testimonies of the survivors of Stalingrad reveal an indifference to human life that seems to characterize the conflicts of that era. In fact, Declassified secret Soviet archives later showed that the authorities not only abandoned the prisoners to their fate, but also that the conditions in the camps were deliberately inhumane. The impact of Stalingrad persists, as the memory of the battle remains a symbol of tragedy and human resistance. The lessons of history about the treatment of prisoners of war and wartime ethics resonate today as we debate respect for human rights amid contemporary military tensions. Although the past cannot be undone, reflecting on these events remains crucial to prevent the repetition of such horrors.